You're watching Knowledge and Wisdom, where we explore the depths of history, theology, philosophy, archaeology, and beyond. If you're curious to uncover truth and insight across time, this is the place for you. Hi, so Dr. Jodi Magness, really excited to have you. Welcome to the show, Reason and Theology. As I understand, you're going to be delivering a lecture or course and series of lectures on Herod the Great, the Tyrant of Christmas. This is a fascinating topic just because, we all love learning about history and biblical figures. So I'm excited that you're going to be doing this, especially around Christmas time. So really looking forward to this discussion. But let me first just welcome you. How are you?
Thank you. I'm great. Yes. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, really excited about this. And I'm curious, what made you and motivated you to come up with this particular topic for this course?
Well, frankly, actually, they asked me, Bart's group asked me if I would do it, but it works very well because I'm going to be writing a book about Herod next year, hopefully on sabbatical. So I've been doing a lot of reading up on Herod. I mean, I've been doing work on Herod for a while anyway, but really deep dives. So it works very well.
He's one of those figures that even if you've read the Bible 20 times, you may just not know a whole lot about his historical background. So I'm really looking forward to learning about that. So let's maybe start there. Talk to me about the historical context behind Herod the Great, maybe specifically why it's important to know about the Hasmonean period under Roman rule and how that ties into Herod.
Right. And actually, before we continue, I'll say that you just mentioned that if you read the Bible, right, you won't necessarily find out a lot about Herod. And that's true. And I'm actually covering this in my class at UNC right now with my undergraduate class. And they're actually a series of Herods because Herod had sons who sort of inherited parts of his kingdom and actually a grandson who also did. And in the Bible, they're all called Herod. They're just called Herod. So if you read the Bible and you keep coming across Herod, you may not realize that it's not the same guy. So anyway,
even within the Gospels, or does that include the book of Acts?
Yes, within the Gospels, within Acts. Yep. So you got to be careful to know which Herod they're referring to. I actually like to say that when I teach this to my students about, Herod had 9 or 10 wives and numerous offspring. And the 3 who sort of ended up inheriting parts of his kingdom were all named Herod. So I say it's kind of like George Foreman. You know what George Foreman's sons are all named, right? So it's kind of, it's kind of like that, right?
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that's something that would often be overlooked if you're just opening up the Gospels or the book of Acts.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's right. Exactly. The Herod who's mentioned as having beheaded John the Baptist is one of Herod's sons, Herod the Great.
Okay.
Not Herod himself, right? So anyway, there's a whole sort of history there. I actually am not going to go into that I'm giving 2 lectures, and they're really focused on Herod the Great. So they're not, I don't cover sort of the afterlife, what happens after he dies. And that, all leads up to the outbreak of the first Jewish revolt against the Romans. So that's not covered in these particular lectures. But anyway, just so your listeners are aware that there's more than one Herod lurking in the biblical stories. But I start with going all the way back to the Hasmoneans because Herod is very complex in many ways. So now I'm just going to refer to Herod as Herod, but I mean Herod, who we usually call Herod the Great. You could actually say Herod the Not So Great because of his reputation, but anyway, I start with the background because he's a very complex figure, and it's important to understand the background, to understand who Herod was, why he did what he did, and sort of how it is that he came to be king of Judea, ruling as king on behalf of the Romans. So that's why I kind of go back in time. I won't be spending huge amounts of time on it, but just to kind of set it up.
Yeah. Okay. That's good. Now, I understand that the historian Josephus, writing a little bit, after the period of the Gospels, at least as I understand, describes Herod, but of course the Gospels describe him as well. How do they maybe compare and contrast and also just shape the way that we understand Herod today?
Right. So nearly all of our information about Herod, at least our written literary or historical information, comes from Josephus's works.
Mm.
Josephus was a Jewish historian. He was not a contemporary of Herod. He was born about, let's see, 37. So he's born about 40 years after Herod's death. And so he doesn't have a personal knowledge or acquaintance with Herod. Instead, he got his information from lost sources, sources that otherwise have not been preserved. Primarily a biography of Herod that was written by Herod's court biographer. We know about the biography, but it's lost. But a lot of Josephus's information comes from there. We of course do have the one, at least, we have a little bit of information / references in the Bible, but not very much in the way of real information about Herod. So most of it really does come from Josephus. There are also references
Mm.
to Herod in later sources, for example, rabbinic Jewish sources, places
Mhm.
like that. But Josephus really is our primary written source. My interest, by the way, I'm an archaeologist. So,
Oh,
and I know you wanted to talk a little bit about Herod's
yeah.
buildings. So, as an archaeologist, for me, archaeological remains are a very important source of information about Herod. And I'm interested in trying to look at how we can combine what we get from Josephus and to a lesser degree other sources with the archaeology and try and round it out and learn more about Herod that way.
And I'm going to follow up with that, but let me ask just a little bit more about Josephus. I mean, from what I understand, sometimes he's not entirely reliable.
Oh, well,
Is he reliable here?
I mean, look, so yeah, I mean, yeah. Um, the the question of Josephus's reliability depends on who you ask and exactly what part of Josephus you're looking at. So
Yeah.
what has happened is that the trend in scholarship over the past X number of decades, let's say 50 years or so, has been to view Josephus's writings more and more skeptically, right, as
Okay.
less and less reliable. My take on it is that actually, depending on what part of Josephus you're looking at, he isn't necessarily unreliable. I mean, I don't. It depends, and so I actually think that there is a lot of valuable information in Josephus, but it's just like anything else. You have to read it critically, right? And you have to examine what exactly you're looking for. I have in the past, I haven't done it recently, but I've taught 2 or 3 times a graduate seminar called Excavating Josephus, where
Mhm.
we this again graduate students, so with reading, knowledge of ancient Greek, and what I asked them to do was I assigned them specific archaeological sites, what are now archaeological sites, let's say places in Jerusalem or Caesarea or Masada or whatever, and I said, I want you to look at Josephus's descriptions of these sites and see whether what we have in the archaeology corresponds with what Josephus describes. And
Mhm.
actually, it turns out that Josephus is pretty much accurate most of the time. So it again, it depends on what you're looking at exactly. I tend to be more optimistic about
Mhm.
the level of reliable information. Not to say it's completely, but again, you have to look at it critically. And so there's that. But there is also, at the same time, no doubt that Josephus presented information in a way that served his own personal purposes, which were many
Okay.
and varied. So he skewed things or he put a spin on them, and that doesn't mean that the information necessarily is false, but it's how it's presented. So his presentation of Herod is overwhelmingly negative. I mean, he presents
Mm.
Herod in a very negative light, and a large reason why today Herod is viewed so negatively, in addition to what the Bible says, by the way, but
Yeah.
a very large reason is because of the way Josephus presents Herod. And Herod undoubtedly was a very bad man. I mean, he did a lot of really, really awful things.
Yeah.
But he's much more complex than that. And like anybody else, that he actually did some good things as well, I think.
Right.
And but you wouldn't necessarily get that impression if you read just Josephus, right? So again, I think that here is where we can see maybe the value of archaeology in fleshing out some of what we know about Herod and his complexity as an individual. And you could actually say today too, look around and say, in many parts of the world today, that there are rulers or people in power who many people think are horrible and dislike, but that doesn't mean that they don't also do some good things.
That's true. I mean, we tend to be complex that way as humans, right?
Yep,
We
exactly.
can have a good side and a bad
Right.
side.
Hmm.
Yeah. So Josephus's account here, you say it's pretty critical of Herod, as is the biblical account. Are they in agreement with each other about Herod, or are there some tensions there?
Well, so I mean, the biblical account, there's very little, right, in
Yeah,
the
very
biblical
little.
account, right? So the main, I mean, the main thing, of course, is Matthew's, story of the massacre of the innocents,
Right.
which present, and of course, the Gospels were written down at least long after Herod's death. Josephus, at least, was born 40 years after Herod's death, and then wrote his works, as you said, probably around the time of the Gospels, uh, more or less. So the gospel, when you read the gospel story, it's actually written down, decades after, a very long time after Herod's death, and it's apparently preserving some tradition or memories, right? But that doesn't. So anyway, so if we just look at the story of the massacre of the innocents, yes, it's very negative, right? It's presenting Herod in a negative light, and that corresponds with Josephus's presentation of Herod in a negative light. So yes, you could say that kind of reinforces it. And in fact, the story of the massacre of the innocents is probably why Herod has become infamous in
Right.
history. I mean, he's probably known for that more than anything else, at least.
Is that story corroborated by Josephus or other sources?
No, and that's actually the problem. There is no independent corroboration of that story. In fact, as I'm sure you're aware, Matthew is the only one who presents that story. We don't even
Right.
have it in any of the other gospel accounts. So there's no other source for that episode, and therefore scholars debate whether it even happened. That is it historical or not? And I have no particular stand on that. I don't really have an investment in whether the story is historical or not. I think the story is interesting and what it tells us about Herod's reputation, but I don't know if it ever occurred or not. Some scholars have suggested that maybe it arose because of Herod's reputation for killing his own sons.
Mm,
And that's one of the things that Herod did during the course of his lifetime. He actually had 3 of his sons executed. And so maybe that kind of gave rise to this kind of idea of the massacre of the innocents. Maybe, don't know. But I do think that the story of the massacre of the innocents is interesting in other ways because of what it sort of reflects about Herod's reputation.
yeah, and I've seen biblical scholars kind of debate: is Matthew just trying to use this as a rhetorical story to make some other point, or is this actually something that he's saying happened historically? So biblical scholars will debate that, I guess, until the cows come home. Let's talk a little bit about building projects of his. I mean,
Right.
he's pretty known for some of them. So talk about them and tell us, what does it tell us about his character and legacy?
Well, so whereas Herod probably overwhelmingly in the public sphere, if anybody knows of Herod, has this very negative reputation, among archaeologists, he's known as the single greatest builder in the history of the country. I mean, he
Mm,
built more than any other individual. He literally transformed the landscape for, well, until now, and left us archaeological remains, which are extremely rich in terms of the information that they provide. I mean, he literally transformed the appearance of the temple and the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. He
mm,
established the largest artificial port and harbor that had existed up until that time on the coast at Caesarea. He has these spectacular desert palaces like Masada. So, I mean, archaeologically, Herod is just a treasure trove. And that's why I think that it's so important to include the archaeological evidence when we study Herod together with the literary sources. I think they kind of balance out and round out what we know about Herod.
to make the Temple Mount, I vaguely recall something about how him having to lay a whole foundation there. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, yeah, and if your listeners are interested, by the way, I published a book in 2024 called "Jerusalem Through the Ages: From Its Beginning
Mm,
to the Crusades," and there's a
nice.
big chunk of it, a big chapter in there on Herod's Jerusalem and particularly the Temple Mount, which goes into a
Yeah.
lot of this information. But basically, he greatly enlarged the Temple Mount, which is the platform, the open esplanade on which the temple building stood. But that esplanade is on sloping ground. And therefore, in order to be able to expand the size of the esplanade, he had to construct these underground arches to support the extension at the south, and then the whole thing gets walled in. And I mean, it was a massive undertaking. And by the way, that part of the project, we're talking about the Temple Mount now and not the temple building itself, that part of the project continued for decades, long after Herod's death, because it was just such a big building project.
Are there any remains of that today? I'm sorry, excuse my ignorance here.
Absolutely. Yeah, no. So we don't have physical remains of the temple building itself.
Right.
But the Temple Mount, as you see it today, is largely a product of Herod's reconstruction. And there are large parts of the original Herodian construction that are still preserved and visible. I mean, the lower parts of, even if you go just to the so-called, Western Wall, right? Sometimes
yeah.
Wall, right? The lower parts of that wall are still the original Herodian construction, but there are also segments of that all around the area of the Temple Mount.
Yeah, I noticed that in the foundation that you're walking there on the Western Wall. Is that the one that he laid down?
No, when you're on the Western Wall Plaza today, right? That is where you're at a higher level than the level of the street was at the time of Herod. But if you go a little bit to the south of there, so if you're looking at the wall a little to the right or the south, there's an big excavated area, and there you see the original paved street from Herod's time running along the side of the Temple Mount. And by the way, that street again was actually laid decades after Herod's death, because the construction around the Temple Mount was continuing for so long.
Wow. Yeah, I'd love to ask more about that. I know we're under the gun here for time. So let me just ask you one final question about the course specifically. What is the main takeaway that you want people who take the course and your students to come away with? What's the main point?
Well, I think that the main thing is to have this where we kind of started our talk, right? To sort of understand better Herod's complexity as an individual, to sort of think about different aspects of his character and his self-representation and the way that he thought of himself. As we see when we combine the archaeological remains, I'm going to be focusing quite a bit on Herod's tomb at Herodium, which is the mountain where he was buried when he died, and talk about what that tells us about Herod's self-representation.
Awesome. I'm really looking forward to it, Dr. Magness, and I'm going to put a link to it where the viewers can go and sign up for the course. I'll put a link to it there in the show notes, so y'all go and check it out. Thank you so much. It was an honor having you on.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much for watching. Make sure to subscribe. And for a deeper dive, check out my courses at rtcourses.com and my Patreon channel at patreon.com/reason in theology.